We'll be waiting for about 30 seconds or so before we actually get formally started here. So hang on, everyone. Okay, I think we can begin our proceedings, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's event and to thank all of you for joining us this morning, evening, afternoon, whatever the time zone is where you may be located. My name is Liz Perry, and I teach in the Harvard Government Department and also serve as director of the Harvard-Yenching Institute. And I'd like to begin with a few announcements on behalf of the Ash Center. First, a statement that the Ash Center has asked me to read. The Ash Center would like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people, and a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. Second, I'd like to acknowledge the co-sponsors of today's discussion. In addition to the Ash Center, which is our primary host, the event today is co-sponsored by the Harvard-Yenching Institute and also by the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. This event is being recorded, and the video will be made available on the Ash Center YouTube channel. So feel free in future to access it and share it with others. You're also welcome today to submit questions at any time throughout the event. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, not the chat function, to submit questions that you may have. Some of you have already submitted questions, but others of you are free using the Q&A function, please, not the chat function, to submit your questions. Now I'd like to introduce our main speaker for today, Professor Tony Saich. Tony is the Daewoo Professor of International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School and also is the director of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. Tony has published very widely on the history and the politics of modern and contemporary China, with particular emphasis on the changing role of the Chinese Communist Party. And most recently, he is the author of a brand new book that has just come out from Harvard University Press, entitled From Rebel to Ruler, 100 Years of the Chinese Communist Party. And that book, of course, is the focus of our discussion today. So I'm going to first turn things over to Tony for some opening remarks, and then he and I will have a back and forth for a little bit before opening things up to the audience for their questions, which I will continue to moderate. So again, please do feel free to submit questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. But let me begin the proceedings by turning things over to my colleague and friend, Tony Saich. Tony.
Great, thanks very much, Liz. And also let me add my welcome to everybody who's joining us. It's a little difficult to get through 100 years of history in 15 or 20 minutes. So what we thought we would do is start with thinking about the founders of the Chinese Communist Party when those 13 young Chinese men, a Dutchman and a Russian, met in Shanghai in 1921 to think about what might they think about China today under the leadership of Xi Jinping. They certainly couldn't have foreseen that within 30 years they would be holding power in China, and probably never occurred to them that within 100 years they might actually be sending shivers down the spine of many of those in Washington who see China as the major challenge to US power throughout the world. Well, from its origins, the Chinese Communist Party really sought to transform China's society, its economy, and politics, I think, to bring about the well-known slogan of bringing wealth and power to China. So I think to that extent, they would probably be happy and they probably would be proud of China's CCP today. But I think they'd be much more baffled by the current embrace of capitalism and its role within the world order, state capitalism, of course. But I think that raises a fundamental question, which has been much debated, about whether the communist revolution was one of nationalism or one of communism. And I think from its founding, actually, the answer to that question, it's been both. The young intellectuals saw Leninism as a vehicle to drive China towards its rightful place in the world. And Xi Jinping has linked his China dream of national rejuvenation to the original mission of the CCP that was to bring happiness to the Chinese people and relieve the nation from the humiliation, or the national humiliation, that it had suffered at the hands of foreigners. He noted that if one never forgot why one started, then you can accomplish your mission. So first then, yet from day one, the Chinese Communist Party portrayed itself as providing a radical break with the past. During the first decades of the 20th century, radical intellectuals were attacking the Chinese tradition and its inheritance in the cultural and political sphere. The only way to interpret the world, in their view, was through the lens of class and class warfare. The CCP in those early days, or the members of the CCP, saw themselves as part of a global revolution that was going to overthrow the colonial world order and issue one led by the representatives of the proletariat. In this brave new world, there would be no place for capitalists, no place for landlords, or for foreign exploiters. Class warfare was the name of the game. So before and after 1949, landlords were extinguished. In the 50s, the foreigners expunged, the private business communities squeezed and eventually eliminated. Before, of course, in the 1960s, Mao Zedong turned his ire on those within the Chinese Communist Party that he saw taking the revolution back down a capitalist road. By contrast, Xi Jinping no longer portrays the party as representing such a radical break with the past. In fact, this has been a long-term trend because following Mao's death in 1976, the CCP began to shun that class-based approach to politics, and the leadership turned to reviving the economy. So more class reconciliation than class conflict at that time, and a role for private entrepreneurs to deliver on the economic needs. Xi, I think, traces his legitimacy in two different ways. One, through a continuity of history of the Chinese Communist Party itself. So he's been at pains to stress there are not two histories of the Communist Party post-49, one under Mao up to 1978 and one post-1978 when reform starts, often attributed to Deng Xiaoping and his leadership. Rather, it's been a continuity of experimentation over that period of time, and that has led to a dramatic reconsideration of how one looks at the Cultural Revolution. So it's no longer described as responsible for the most severe setback and the heaviest losses for the party and society, but rather is seen as a misguided experiment to cure corruption, bureaucratism, and so forth, that provided extremely painful lessons. But of course, Xi also draws a much deeper connection, I would say more than any of the other Communist Party leaders, to the 2,000, 5,000, however you want to define it, years of Chinese history, and that in fact, not the Kuomintang on Taiwan, but the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing is the inheritor of that glorious past. One thing they all agree on, though, over this period of time, except for a brief break in the Cultural Revolution, is the view that the party is the only vehicle that can lead China along the correct path towards the future. So for Xi Jinping, a unified, disciplined party is essential to push ahead with his policy preferences, and he will not tolerate any public dissent about the objectives of the mission or the means to achieve it. Now, the CCP was, of course, founded in an era of uncertainty, with many worried about the nation's future. The first party congress was a very raucous affair, in fact, as participants debated wildly and seriously different views about the nature of the revolution and the role of the party. That fluidity around that time, I think, has shown there's only two of those members stuck with the Communist Party all the way through to 1949. And importantly, of course, one of those members was Mao Zedong. And in the 1940s, Mao exterminated many of the remnants of the more cosmopolitan atmosphere that had prevailed amongst the left within China, and he posed a narrative on party members for all to follow, and alternative views were driven out and an orthodoxy established. Xi Jinping, I think, has taken that approach to heart, expecting obedience not only from party members, but also from society at large. And following Mao's lead, he sees no need for independent intellectual inquiry about the revolution's trajectory. Journalists are not to investigate the dark side, but to propagate party views. Universities are meant to be incubators of Marxist thought, not necessarily Marxist practice, but Marxist thought. So the centrality of the party and its unique ability to define the policies necessary to drive China forward also means that the party goes to great lengths to describe itself as infallible. A little bit of a problem, given the mistakes, of course, economically with the Great Leap Forward, which may have led to up to 30 million deaths, and the political disasters which came with the Cultural Revolution, when millions were persecuted for being supposed class enemies. As a result, blame has to be found elsewhere. And again, there's a long history of this. Chen Duxiu and his right opportunism, Li Lisan and his leftism, the Gang of Four, of course, derailing things in the Cultural Revolution. And as a result, that is something which comes down to the day, either with party members who have infiltrated with evil intent to lead the party astray, or with foreigners seeking to undermine CCP rule. So, for example, the demonstrations in Hong Kong did not elicit a review of CCP policy, but rather were blamed on a handful of people inciting trouble and the action of foreigners stirring up trouble. There's two inheritances which are somewhat complicated. The first is dealing with foreigners, and the second is what you do with private entrepreneurs. So dealing with foreigners has involved a complex set of relationships in the past, and I think also in the present. The First Party Congress announced the intention to eradicate the foreign colonial presence in China. The proletarian ally of Soviet Russia was a different matter, and the party probably would not have survived and thrived without its early support. But gradually what was developed was a narrative of the 100 years of humiliation at the hands of foreign forces dating back to the First Opium War. Thus, the CCP came to power claiming that it would set right the injustices of the compromise of China's sovereignty. And so while the CCP under Mao Zedong saved the country from dismemberment and ruin, Xi Jinping intends to complete the unfinished project through his China dream of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which he hopes then will allow China to deal with the foreigners on its own terms and from a position of strength. As I said, there's also an ambiguity about what to do about private commerce. And while the First Party Congress expressed the clear desire to overthrow the capitalist structures, introduce the dictatorship of the proletariat, nationalize industry, the period since 1978 has seen a much more complex challenge. We've seen the massive engagement, first with foreign investment in the Chinese economy, the importance of export-led growth, followed by China's increasing presence on the world stage. But I would say, despite that, the CCP's attitude towards enterprise, and particularly foreign intent, remains one of caution and suspicion. And where possible, Xi Jinping's policies have provided preferential treatment for the state-owned sector to pursue domestic and international agendas. By contrast, the private sector, although now legitimized, has been disfavored in terms of access to capital and investment, and has been reined in once it seems becoming too influential, or where business seems to be evading party oversight. The most recent obvious example with Jack Ma and Ant Financial and the Alibaba empire. The last point I want to just touch on briefly is, what about the Chinese Communist Party's worldview? Well, from its origins until the present, a crucial part of the CCP's mission has been to build a new, more favorable global order. Thus, I think it should come as no surprise that General Secretary Xi Jinping sees the mission of the CCP to restructure the global order in a manner that reflects better China's priorities. But of course, what that order is and how change should be pursued has changed dramatically over time. Initially, the Chinese Communist Party saw itself as a key member of the International Proletarian Alliance that would rid the world of colonialism and the domestic oppression of rapacious landlords and industrialists. And that's changed in the 50s, in the 60s, down to the present. I would say that Xi Jinping's approach contains both elements of the inherited Marxist tradition, as well as influences from the traditional Chinese view of the global order. So, for example, he evokes historical materialism to explain the inevitable decline of the West and the rise of a socialist China. At the same time, though, he envisages contemporary China occupying the space under the traditional notion of Tianxia, with the nation at the center of a Chinese cultural sphere, one might now add economic sphere, that radiates out to draw others into its sphere of influence. So while that field of radiation is far wider than in the days of empire, the CCP, I don't think, is forcing others to adopt its system wholesale or for other nations to become subordinated states. That said, the CCP under Xi clearly sees its economic and political model as one that enjoys legitimacy, deserves respect, and that others could follow should they so wish. So finally, then, of course, Xi Jinping has tools, power, and influence at his disposal that the founders of the party and even Mao Zedong could never have imagined. And these are, of course, carrots and sticks, the carrots of investment, Belt and Road, and the stick of aggression in the South China Seas and in East China Seas, and a more aggressive approach in its diplomacy. None of this means, in my view, that the CCP any longer wants to overturn the global order in its entirety, but rather to shape it to reflect better its own interests. Unlike the internationalists of the First Party Congress, the Chinese Communist Party is now one of the most fervent defenders of the Westphalian nation state. Its approach to the current global order varies depending on issue or institution. So while while China has been a strong defender of the UN Charter, it has rejected international security on rulings over the South China Seas, for example. Similarly, it has sought to emasculate the impact of international human rights regimes, for which it has found willing support from other authoritarian regimes. So I would say, finally, the earlier appeals to internationalism and universalism have been replaced by a much more targeted focus on the pursuit of the national interest as defined by the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping.
Tony, thank you so much for that extremely stimulating opening set of remarks. And as I mentioned to you the other day, I thoroughly enjoyed reading your book. I enjoyed reading it for many reasons, but one of the reasons I particularly enjoyed it was the kind of personal approach it takes to your own discovery of the history of the Chinese Communist Party. And so I wanted to begin this morning by asking you a couple of questions about your own intellectual journey in Chinese politics. I noticed that you, in addition to your family members, also in your acknowledgements of the book, acknowledged two of your former teachers, David Goodman and Stuart Schramm. I'm guessing you got some of your appreciation for the kind of local grounded side of Chinese communist practice from David, and your appreciation for the importance of the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party and the thought of the supreme leader of the party from Stuart. But first of all, let me give you an opportunity to talk just a bit about your own intellectual heritage and lineage, and how important those teachers were in your own development.
Well, I think you've answered well the influence of the two of them. David taught me in my last year as an undergraduate, in the days when no one taught classes on China because it was irrelevant, and you could maybe sneak it in as a little bit of a comparative communism course. But David got me intrigued because, as you say, that outside of the stereotypical view at the time, and I think one which persists to the day, he really showed to me just the complexity of Chinese politics. There really is politics taking place there. And in particular, the variation between what the center does, or says rather, and what the local does. And so that really set me off on the route towards SOAS, School of Oriental African Studies, and Stuart. And as you said, I mean, Stuart, as we know, was the primary definer for those of us in the West about what Mao's thought was, what it contributed to a Marxist canon. And of course, this was at a time when very few of us had access to China. We knew very little about what was taking place in China. And there were many sort of myths built around China, which I think had more to do with our own politics than the politics in China. And of course, it played into things such as the anti-Vietnam War movement, that there must be something good about China if it was standing behind the Vietnamese, pushing back against American hegemony, and so on and so forth. And so both of those teachers were able to introduce me to some more of the sophistication. And then I was very lucky to get a British Council scholarship to go to China towards the end of the Cultural Revolution. And that was revealing for me in the sense that very early on in my career, I was able to live in China, interact in as far as one could with other Chinese students and hear from Chinese teachers, and realize that much of the nonsense which was being portrayed in the West about how Mao's thought could help the blind see and the deaf hear again was not taken that seriously, and one shouldn't take it that seriously. And in fact, as I discovered, it was often pushed by those who were opposed to Mao, because how do you unravel Maoism? One way is to make it totally ridiculous, and then were totally baffled when I told them that many foreigners, or some foreigners rather, actually believed some of this. So having studied in China was really a defining moment for me. And particularly, I think being able to go that early to China helped me begin to appreciate language and the way language was used by the Chinese Communist Party from very early on.
Right. For the rest of you who may not yet have had a chance to take a look at the book, you'll enjoy some of the photographs. There's a picture of Tony as a dashing young man in China in the early 1980s. I think that picture was taken with Luo Zhanglong, the leader of the famous railway strike in the very early period of Chinese communist history. And Tony, throughout the book, interjects his own kind of changing views as a result of his experience there. So I think that's another really very important feature of the book. I wanted to ask you a bit, you began your comments this morning by asking this very provocative question of what would those individuals who founded the Chinese Communist Party in July of 1921 think of the party today, 100 years later. And I wanted to ask you your thoughts on how they might regard the fact, I mean, you alluded to it in your discussion of ideology and the change from more universalistic to nationalistic views, but on a kind of more personal sense of what they might think of the leadership of the Communist Party today. As you point out in your book, these early leaders basically were intellectuals. Li Dazhao was the head librarian at Peking University. Chen Duxiu was the dean at Peking University. Even Mao, although obviously not as famous and intellectual as those others, had been working in the library at Peking University and had received a serious education back in his home province of Hunan, became well respected for his calligraphy and his poetry writing and so forth. Now we have a leader of the Communist Party who sometimes stumbles over difficult Chinese characters and, as you mentioned, is very keen on using the authority and legitimacy of classical Chinese tradition to claim that the contemporary party is the authentic inheritor of 2,000 or 5,000 years of glorious Chinese tradition, but himself is trained more in engineering than in the classics. Many have questioned his educational credentials. And the premier, although certainly has a PhD, again, more practical in urban economics, and instead of this kind of broader, more philosophical training that put that earlier generation in much more genuine conversation with the Chinese classical tradition. So let me ask you a bit of your thoughts about that. Is it a problem, would you say, that the top leaders of the Chinese Communist Party today, although of course they boast contemporary educational credentials, nevertheless lack that kind of classical Chinese background and really are much more pragmatic engineers, managerial types than they are big thinkers? Is that a problem for what they're hoping to accomplish in China? Is it a problem for the success of the China dream, for example?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. First, one comment on the photos. I did want to put into the book a photo of me in Tiananmen Square smashing the Gang of Four back in the demonstrations of 1976, but the editors said, that's too personal. You know, that's too much about you and not enough about the history. But it passed with Luo Zhenglong because he is a historical figure. This is a fascinating question. And, you know, one of the ironies at the First Party Congress, of course, and also in those couple of years, was they represented 53 people. And they denounced the intellectual class. They didn't want to have anything to do with it, yet they themselves really were students, intellectuals. And I think importantly, as you mentioned, they were part of a debate taking place across many different streams of thought about what was the most acceptable way to move China forward. And we all know the inches and drops arguments between Li Dazhao and Hu Shi. You know, should it be incremental movement forward, or did you need that totalistic vision to push China forward? But, you know, anarchism was very strong. Social democracy was very strong. Dewey's influence via Hu Shi was also very strong. And as I mentioned, you know, of those 13 men, and they were men, 11 did not stick with the Communist Party. And even at the First Party Congress, some were saying, well, maybe we should wait. Maybe we should explore social democracy. Maybe there are other patterns which might be more suitable for China's future. But that has gone in the present time in two ways. It's gone in the sense of really thinking about alternatives and setting it in a broader framework of where is China and where does China want to be and where it wants to move to. And secondly, as you suggested, and I think this is very true, These are technicians who run China. I remember being at the 100th anniversary of the founding of Peking University, and Jiang Zemin made one, I thought, very politically smart comment. And he said, 清华是我们的党代，北大是我们的未来, which met with enormous applause in Peking University. Tsinghua is our present, Peking University is our future. And I think what he meant by that was, we will at some stage move beyond the technocratic tinkering, getting the economy phase going to where we will need to embed the future in discussions about Chinese culture, about Chinese history, Chinese philosophy. One hopes, although that may not have been his intention, to engage again the Chinese public about the kind of future they would like to see China be. And that is not a discussion I see the current leadership either being equipped for or not interested in pursuing. It is clearly, the party represents the advanced elements, therefore the party decides what that future is. And it eschews an engagement with its society about what would people like to see, how would they like to see China moving forward. So I think you're right in identifying those as constraints for China's future development. Engineers and technicians, no disrespect to any who may be on the call, only get you so far.
I wanted to turn to a couple of broader questions, which also have been reflected in a number of the questions that members of the audience have submitted. You are the director of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. And are there things, would you say, in the history and experience of the Chinese Communist Party that offer particularly useful lessons, be they cautionary lessons or lessons that call for imitation in terms of either democratic governance or innovation? Of course, the party itself has long presented its way of decision-making as democratic centralism. And Mao, in particular, was known for big democracy, calling on ordinary people to get out and express their opinions through big character posters and through loud protests and so forth, as long as they didn't go too far in challenging his own preferences. But is this just only rhetoric, or is there anything, would you say, in the history or practice or ideology of the Chinese Communist Party that you think is useful for those of us who are interested in questions of democratic governance on the one hand, and then more broadly on issues of innovation? Would you say, some have suggested that the Chinese Communist Party is really not very different from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, on which it was in many ways closely modeled, and that although Mao certainly had his idiosyncrasies and his dislike for bureaucratism and the like, that in fact, nevertheless, the party has always kind of returned to replicate that Soviet model. But yet others think that there are some really distinctive elements of Chinese Communist Party governance that are quite innovative, that depart in important ways from Soviet precedents, and that help us understand the resilience of the Chinese Communist Party. So let me ask you to reflect a little bit on this question of democratic governance and innovation.
Yes. Well, yes, in form, of course, the Chinese Communist Party looks like a traditional Leninist party. Its structures, its constitutions, and so forth. But that doesn't explain why it has been able to persist down to the present day, because on the whole, we tend to think of Leninist parties as being inflexible and not adaptable to conditions. And I think one of the major features of the Chinese Communist Party has been its adaptability over time. to deal with very different situations. In the 90s, for example, being eventually becoming open to include private entrepreneurs into the party, to different forces into the party, to the point where I would say now really it's not a proletarian or peasant party anymore. It's clearly a party that represents the new elites within China, with some kind of barriers around those. So where has that innovation come from? And I think this is a worry for the current leadership. A lot of that innovation, I think, has been where it's been good at micropolitics. If you look both before 1949, the party was most successful where it didn't faithfully follow ideology and try to implement ideological imperatives in terms of its class warfare that I talked about earlier, but really to engage with local society that felt it gave them a stake in what was happening, yet always made sure it kept good control over what the outcome of that process might be. And so it survived and thrived, I would say, where it was good at local politics and tended to fail where a sort of ideological orthodoxy took over. And I think if we look at the reform period, there's been a lot of innovation which is now being eschewed. The party itself did try and introduce new mechanisms for better feedback within the party. Might not be so attractive to us, but I think for other authoritarian regimes, how do you survive as an authoritarian regime, but build in feedback loops, both the members of your own party and also to sense what are priorities within society that you might have to deal with. And I think the Communist Party had been relatively successful at that. The main thing I think was really under Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and in the 1980s, really allowing local adaptability, local experimentation. And I think that has been a hallmark of Chinese Communist Party rule, which has been successful. A lot of things were not dictated by the center. The township and village enterprises was not a central party policy. Deng Xiaoping at some point in the mid-80s said, where do they come from? That was never party policy, and yet it employed 140 million people. Baogan Daewoo contracting, output back to the household, really operated against much of the central party wishes. And so having that kind of flexibility, allowing innovation, which could then be looked at, and this is something you've written about, and Sebastian Heilmann has written about, this whole process of innovation at the local level, how that feeds up and how that may become national policy, I do think is an area of innovation which has been successful. That is not democratic innovation, obviously, which is a completely different question. Why do I say it's a problem now? Because I think under Xi Jinping, he saw many of the downsides of that. Corruption taking place, local governments pursuing their own interests rather than the interests of the national state. Society beginning to flourish with different ideas, pushing back against the central narrative. And as we all know, he's really centralized control in that process. And the question I think then arises, does that mean the innovation that we've seen previously and the dynamism, which I think has surprised most of us, a number of times, many have sort of predicted, this is the end for the Chinese Communist Party, and yet it never has been. Does it really throttle that dynamism and innovation that has really kept the system and the party going? So yes, I think there has been innovation. I don't think the innovations the party puts forward are necessarily all due to itself, for example, in terms of alleviating poverty. I'm not for a moment suggesting that the poverty has not been alleviated, but I think it has been more because of the broader shifting of policy frameworks rather than the direct interventions of party into poverty alleviation programs. So I think giving more rein to society to experiment, to be a little bit freer, I think has been a hallmark of its success. And now we'll see if that is really being constrained and restrained. Is that viable moving forward?
You mentioned that one of the reasons for the retrenchment in this local experimentation was concern over corruption at the grassroots level. Let me ask you about Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign, which is now the longest lasting campaign in Chinese history. And I'd be interested in your assessment of its achievements and shortcomings. Some have argued that the anti-corruption campaign is really an effort to get rid of Xi Jinping's opponents, potential rivals within the party. Others have seen it as rather effective in cleaning up some of those examples of cadre malfeasance that marked earlier administrations of the Chinese Communist Party. And yet others have pointed to a kind of paralysis of party officials, local cadres, who are so afraid that anything they do might be declared corrupt that they're unwilling to take risks, and that this loss of kind of micro level innovation will ultimately be devastating for the party. I understand now that there's a major effort at 调查 or retroactive investigations into corrupt behavior that wasn't necessarily illegal at the time that the actions occurred, but now 20 years later, you go back and deem these activities to have been corrupt and illegal and deserving of punishment now. So this is obviously both a very long-lived and in some ways escalating campaign of anti-corruption. And I am interested in your views about it.
I would say the answer is all of the above. I mean, it's quite clear that in certain circumstances, corruption has been used to remove potential rivals to Xi Jinping. I don't think there's anything about that. You know, the removal of Sun as party secretary in Chongqing, who many thought was being put forward to be Xi Jinping's successor, is one example. The whole issue around Bo Xilai before Xi Jinping formally took power, of course. On the other hand, though, and someone like Wang Qishan, I think, who was seen as one of the people driving this anti-corruption campaign, I think was morally offended by what he saw as the behavior of many party officials at the central level and at the local level. So I do believe that there was also a genuine element to it, because corruption was clearly eroding confidence in the regime. You know, in surveys that we've looked at, you know, starting from 2003, combating corruption always came out as the aspect of government work at the local level that citizens were the least satisfied with, and the one area of work where they wanted to see government paying more attention. So in that sense, you know, it does gain some popular support. Interestingly, when Xi first took power, satisfaction dropped even further, but I think that's because it became more legitimate to talk about local corruption and express your abhorrence of it. But then it picked up again. It's not to a stellar height. So I think it has produced a level of popularity amongst people for the Xi Jinping leadership. It's one of the things I think that they hope might find a deeper legitimacy for themselves, you know, given that very few believe in Marxism-Leninism as a driving force and reason for legitimacy any longer. So it has a popular aspect to it. And we do know that populism really has been promoted over the last 15, 20 years amongst the Chinese leadership. The other 2 points, yes, I mean, I think many of us have heard of instances where local government would prefer, or local agencies across the board might feel it's safer to do nothing than do something, just because of the fear of it being attributed to being corrupt behavior. And remember, you know, all these campaigns that have gone on over the decades you can have enemies everywhere. And people just waiting for the next campaign to come along to be able to get back at you for something that perhaps you did in a previous campaign. So sitting still and holding tight is a pretty reasonable strategy. And I do think, again, going back to the point I made earlier, this might feed into that lack of innovation, which has been really important in local China to keep things moving and keep things going over that period of time. I think, we saw this in the Soviet Union and other countries as well, where, behavior one day, which was considered reasonable and not illegal, then becomes defined as illegal. And I think what it's going to do in China is create much greater fear and uncertainty amongst many communities. I think the private sector, the business sector, already feels itself under much greater scrutiny, not necessarily threat, but certainly under greater scrutiny with recent actions in the financial sector, but also in other areas. And I would think many of those entrepreneurs, given the fact that many of them develop their businesses through very close relationships with the local party, or may have been spin-offs from the local party, could be extremely concerned about this Daojia looking back into history process and applying, regulations now, which may not have been the case or were vague some 20, 25 years ago. So I would think it's a very worrying turn.
Speaking of the discontent of private business, we have a number of questions that have come up on the private sector and the extent to which the party can or cannot properly tame the private sector. Let me ask you about the private business sector and its relationship to the party, and also more broadly about whether you would say there are or not any serious sources of potential opposition to the party's continued hegemony over the Chinese political system. You've mentioned discontent within lower echelons of the party state itself, those officials who feel overly pressured or stymied by the anti-corruption campaign, for example. You've mentioned the question of Chinese society, to some extent happy about the anti-corruption campaign, but also presumably concerned about these increasing tendencies of centralization, standardization, party control, and the like. Do you think that there are serious problems of potential opposition from different elements of society, be it business or ordinary people, or from within the party state itself, from either top rivals to the party secretary or unhappy officials further down the system? Or are these simply kind of normal growing pains of an authoritarian regime, if you will, and perhaps not very serious challenges to the future rule of the party or Xi Jinping's own personal control over the party?
Well, as with the Tiananmen demonstrations in 1989 and with the unraveling of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, we won't know it until it happens. And then, we'll all go back in history and we'll all explain why this was inevitable and why it turned out the way it did. But I think the first point to make is that, that the private business entrepreneurs and the middle class in China are very much products of Communist Party policy. And so at the moment, why sort of rattle the cage that you live in, which has actually been quite a nice gilded cage up until the present time? And I don't see any substantial evidence that there is serious sort of coming together of groups to oppose the leadership at the moment. I think related to that, there's two important questions. First is you would need someone to rally around the way the party works, and I don't see who that person is. I mean, I think Xi Jinping has been very successful in placing supporters in key positions, has been very successful in neutering the debate and potential opponents at the particular time. And then the second point, I think, related to that would be, if it wasn't Xi Jinping, would things be any different? Well, you might have soft authoritarianism rather than hard authoritarianism. But if you go back to probably why the leadership put Xi Jinping in place, it was because they wanted a reliable person, given what they saw as the challenges facing them come 2012. I mean, it looked a mess. I mean, you just had the Bo Xilai affair, the other issues I talked about before, which I won't go back into. Now, those factors seem to probably still be there. So would any leader that replaces Xi Jinping really be willing or wanting to change things very significantly? Now, that doesn't mean there's not grumbling, and it doesn't mean that if a leadership change came, people wouldn't rally behind it. I think one of the things that's always surprised me is how very quickly people, at least publicly, fall in line with whatever's coming down from the center. And I don't think it's all theater and rhetoric. I mean, I think it is sort of belief. And of course, the party is very much able to keep itself together with the line of, you know, après moi le déluge. If you don't have us, you have the chaos. And they'll point back to the Cultural Revolution. They'll point back to what happened in the Soviet Union to explain why a strong hand is still needed. And I think many people, to be honest, buy into that. As long as life is getting better, it's okay. And when you say many people, I don't know. I mean, for a lot of people in China, do these constraints on intellectual debate around setting norms, different norms around private business, does it affect a lot of people in their daily life? I'm not convinced it does. They may be concerned about other issues, employment, income raises, environmental degradation, healthcare insurances. And those are things that the Chinese leadership are actually investing in quite significantly around the kind of social policy and the social infrastructure. So I think the leadership sees that as a more of a warning and problematic area than it might see, you know, crushing down an intellectual dissent or intellectual debate.
I think that's probably a fair enough assessment. I guess there's also the question of what is the alternative, and the alternative, you know, within China, as you say, there's not an obvious alternative, and internationally, with the problems that the pace setters of democracy, the United States and the UK have been experiencing in recent years after Brexit and Donald Trump, it's hard for Chinese who might prefer a more liberal democratic system to look with confidence to an alternative that they feel would work successfully within China. So it strikes me that both domestically and internationally, it is a particularly troubling time for those who consider themselves liberals within China and who have been advocating for greater political freedom and less political centralization, but who now have a hard time, I think, making that argument convincing to a lot of their fellow countrymen. We've had a number of questions in the Q&A and also that were submitted previously about party-state relations in China and how they have changed over time, what you see as the future for them. Should we simply think of the party and state as one entity now, or should we think that there is some daylight between the government side of the system and the Communist Party itself? And going forward, do you see an opportunity in party-state relations for any kind of political innovation?
Yeah, just one comment on your prior remark. I think if the Chinese Communist Party were to accept a move in a more liberal or more democratic way, it's not going to come from any moral or philosophical presentation. It's only going to come from a pragmatic, instrumental view that this may be the only way to still keep the Communist Party relevant in a future moving forward. And although Roger Garside in his recent book has talked about the advent of democracy in China and why it will come much sooner than any of us expect, I'm not so convinced myself about that. On the part of party state, there clearly was in the 1980s a move to be able to separate out party and state. And you had people like Su Xiaozhi, a thinker at that time, saying, we must remember that the Communist Party is meant to be a vanguard. And a vanguard is small. And a vanguard just adopts a leadership role. It doesn't get involved in the day-to-day practicalities. I mean, should the party secretary in a factory really be deciding, do we need 3 toilets on this floor or 2 sets of toilets? Well, if your future hangs on it, maybe it is an important question, but probably not something of burning interest with respect to Marxist-Leninist theory. So we did see that attempt to separate out. And of course, that got blown away after 1989. And we've seen since then progressively a reassertion of party across the board. In the universities, much more strength for the party secretary, party committees than we had anticipated. Similarly, in enterprises, we see it, as you know, in the private sector, in the NGO sector, where it's stressed that they have to set up party committees, and on many decisions, they defer to party committees. So at that level, you could say that sort of sliver of a window has been closed or has been sealed up. But I don't think that tells all of the story, because the Chinese state and the party is an incredibly complex beast. And once you start thinking about the local level, it will still try and find ways to act in its own interests, which may not always coincide with what we're seeing at the center. So take something like WTO, for example. Yeling Tan, PhD student, wrote a very interesting thesis on this, where she showed if you look at the language of the Department of Commerce, it was very much pro WTO norms. Shift over to the NDRC, it's much more state directed. Take it down to the provincial level, it becomes much more kind of state developmental language. And when you go down below that, often documents are very protective of local industry. So I think that's the more important struggle and divisions than simply a kind of party-state dichotomy, which we know has changed over time. I think it's those sort of levels of action that the state is dealing with, whether it's provincial level or sub-provincial level, and how it maneuvers to try and find within the policy framework, within the rhetoric of the time, ways to pursue something which is more naturally in its own interests. And I think that's the more interesting area to look at on that question.
Well, Tony, we're almost out of time here, so I'm just going to ask you a final question, which has come up in the Q&A and is also an important theme really throughout your book, and that is the question of pre-revolutionary Chinese political culture and the impact that you think it does or doesn't have on contemporary party operations, and also looking forward, how important a role it will play in shaping the trajectory of the Chinese Communist Party. Is it just window dressing when Xi Jinping goes up to or down to Qufu in Shandong and pays his respects to Confucius on his birthday? Or is there actually something important here about a continuing effect that aspects of traditional Chinese culture, which is obviously extremely complex and in many ways contradictory, but nevertheless potentially powerful influence on the future of the party or not?
I mean, this is a fascinating question, a difficult one to deal with in a couple of minutes to wrap up. I suppose my first the first point to that is, yes, a caricature and a stereotype of a Confucian political culture, I do think is important to the Chinese Communist Party because it builds a deeper legitimacy than Marxism-Leninism. We are part of a bigger story. We're part of a bigger history that you can all buy into. So I don't think it is merely window dressing. Of course, it's highly selective, tends to ignore the right to rebel ideas and so on and so forth. But I think one of the important questions, though, is which culture and which history? Because, you know, probably much better than I would, you know, China historically is made up of a lot of different histories and multiple cultures, and they play different roles at different times. I first confronted this when I moved to Leiden to work in the Sinological Institute there. And we had one professor who really believed in the Confucian telling of history and the story of history. And it went very vertical. You know, the center decided, the edicts went down, you know, the placards were put outside the door, the couplets in the way they are now of, you know, of the Communist Party couplets that you see in the villages. We had another professor who was an ordained Taoist, and he saw a different history, which was horizontal, which was a different set of networks. So yes, Confucian edicts were passed up, but society lived by Taoist or other practices within the local community, which were not Confucian, but dealt with reciprocity, which dealt with equity, with justice and fairness. And one of the points I talk about in the book, and I'll just finish with this, is, you know, has the party penetrated the clan in southern China, or has the clan imbued into the party? And again, I think it's like all these things, it's a bit of both. You know, for many individuals, the party is not necessarily the most important institution at the very local level. It can be the temple, the miao, the hui, the clan organization. It can be the local place association in the cities for some of the migrant communities, for example. And those are traditional aspects. They were aspects which were extremely important during the Republican period. And they tell a different story from either a top-down CCP narrative, including a CCP narrative which includes this kind of portrayal of Confucian culture.
Have we frozen up? Or
no, I think
I've completed your statement. You completed your statement. You never know with Zoom. You never know with Zoom. I didn't want to cut you off prematurely. Thank you so much, Tony. That was, this has been a really fascinating past hour and a half. And I thank you so much for your comments and your answers to both my questions and the many wonderful questions from the audience. And I thank the audience for being so engaged with so many challenging questions. So my appreciation to the Ash Center for organizing this event, and again, to the Fairbanks Center and also the Harvard-Yenching Institute for their co-sponsorship, and to all of you who participated, thank you so much. And if you really want to get into this subject in greater depth, buy a copy of Tony's new book, From Rebels to Rulers, that just was published by Harvard University Press. So
Unfortunately,
thank
it
you
hasn't just been
so much.
published yet, Liz. It's not.
Oh,
gonna
so
be-
I've only seen the pre-publication.
right.
Okay.
For some
But
reason, they don't.
when is
wanna
the
publish
actual
it.
publication
For some reason,
date?
they don't want to publish until the beginning of July, I think.
Okay, okay. So register
But you can
pre-publication.
pre-buy.
There you go. There you go. No discount, but you can pre-buy. All right. Thank you all very much. And thank you, Tony, for a really fascinating discussion.
Well, thank you, Liz, for being a great moderator. And also thanks to everybody who